a room you know well. You have been sitting in it for weeks now, maybe months. The light from your phone is the only thing moving. The walls have not changed. The silence has not changed. And somewhere between the second hour of scrolling and the moment you finally put the screen down, there is a weight that settles into your chest that you cannot name. It is not sadness exactly. It is not grief. It is something quieter than both. It is the feeling of a man who has run out of people to call, not because the contacts are empty, but because the contacts are beat, but because the conversations would be. You could text someone, you could make plans, you could fill tomorrow night with noise and faces and the temporary warmth of someone else's attention. But you know, and this is the part that keeps you staring at the ceiling, you know it would not touch the thing that actually hurts. Because what hurts is not the absence of people. What hurts is the presence of a question you have been avoiding. Who are you when no one is watching? Who are you when there is no one to perform for, no relationship to hide inside, no group to borrow an identity from? That question is sitting in the room with you right now. And the loneliness you feel is not the problem. The loneliness you feel is not the problem. The loneliness is what happens when the noise finally stops long enough for the question to be heard. I want to talk to you tonight about the lonely chapter, not loneliness as a feeling. You already know that feeling. I want to talk about the lonely chapter as a season, a stretch of time that most men enter terrified, endure miserably, and exit without ever understanding what it was for. Because it was for something, and the man who walks through it unconsciously, numbing, distracting, rushing to fill the space with the first warm body or loud room he can find, that man comes out the other side exactly the same as he went in. The chapter was wasted on him, but the man who walks through it with his eyes open, the man who sits in the discomfort and asks what it is trying to show him, that man comes out rebuilt, not repaired. Rebuilt. There is a difference, and that difference is everything. The noise you mistook for company. Before we talk about what the lonely chapter builds, we need to talk about what it dismantles. Because you did not arrive here by accident. You arrived here because something fell away. A relationship ended. A friendship group dissolved. A social structure you had built your life around shifted. And when it shifted, you discovered something that shook you. You discovered that without that structure, you did not know who you were. That is not a failure. That is a revelation. Most men never get that revelation because they never sit still long enough to receive it. They move from one relationship to the next, one social circle to the next, one identity prop to the next. And the speed of the movement feels like living, but it is not living. It is running. It is running from the silence that would tell them something they do not want to hear. Here is what the silence tells you if you let it. Most of what you called connection was not connection. It was proximity. It was routine. It was the comfort of a familiar voice. Not because that voice knew you, but because it filled the room. Think about the friendships you had a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago. How many of those people knew what you were actually afraid of? How many of them knew the thing you think about at 3 in the morning when the performance drops and the real thoughts begin? How many of them could have told you what you actually wanted from your life? Not the version you presented, but the raw, unpolished, possibly embarrassing truth of what you actually wanted. The answer for most men is 0, or close to it, and that is not because those people were bad. It is because you never let them in that far, and they never pushed to enter, And the whole arrangement, the dinners, the group chats, the weekends, the noise, was a mutual agreement to stay on the surface and call it depth. The lonely chapter strips that agreement away. It removes the cast of characters, and what remains is the set without the actors. And the set, you realize, was never as solid as you thought. The walls were thin. The foundation was shallow. You build a social life the way most men build social lives, reactively, based on proximity, convenience, and whoever happened to be nearby when you needed someone nearby, not deliberately. Not with the question of who do I actually want to become, and who helps me become that. Just whoever showed up. Whoever was easy. Whoever made the silence go away for a few hours. That is not connection. That is anesthesia. And the lonely chapter is what happens when the anesthesia wears off and you feel the full weight of what was always underneath. Not heartbreak, not betrayal, something worse. The realization that you were never as known as you thought you were, that you participated in your own invisibility by never showing anyone who you actually were. And now, in the quiet, there is no one left to distract you from that. The noise you mistook for company has gone silent. And in that silence, you are being asked a question that most men spend their entire lives avoiding. Who are you? Not the version of you that adapts to rooms. Not the version that knows what to say to keep people comfortable. Not the performance, not the role. Who are you when there is no audience, no script, no social incentive to be anything other than exactly what you are? The lonely chapter will answer that question, but only if you stop trying to escape it long enough to hear the answer. The demolition. There is a phase in every building project that looks like destruction. The old structure comes down, the walls are torn out, the foundation is cracked open. If you walked past the site during this phase and did not know what was coming, you would think something terrible had happened. You would think this was loss. You would think someone had destroyed something. But the architect knows better. The architect knows you cannot build something new on a rotten foundation. You cannot add a second floor to a structure that was never designed to carry weight. The demolition is not the disaster. The demolition is the prerequisite. Your lonely chapter is a demolition phase. And I need you to understand that, because right now you are standing in the rubble and calling it ruin. You are looking at the empty calendar, the quiet phone, the Friday nights with no plans, and you are interpreting this as evidence that something is wrong with you, that you are broken, that you are failing at the most basic human task, the task of being wanted, of being chosen, of belonging somewhere. And that interpretation is destroying you. Not the loneliness, the interpretation. Because here's what is actually happening. The structures that were not load-bearing are coming down. The relationships that were built on convenience rather than truth. The friendships that required you to be a version of yourself that was smaller, less honest, less real than who you actually are. The social habits that kept you busy but never made you better. The romantic patterns that gave you warmth without giving you growth. They're all being cleared. And the clearing feels like loss, because you have confused the familiar with the valuable. You have confused what was comfortable with what was good. A man can spend years in a building that is slowly sinking into its own foundation. The floor is slope. The doors do not close properly. The walls crack. But he stays because it is his. Because leaving means admitting it was never built to last. Because the alternative, standing in an open field with nothing, feels worse than living in something broken. That is what most men do with their social lives. They stay in structures that are collapsing because the demolition phase looks too frightening. They would rather live in something broken than stand in the openness that precedes something new. But you are here now. The demolition has already happened, whether you chose it or not. The relationship ended. The friend group fractured. The social world you built went quiet. And you are standing in the open field. exposed, unprotected, alone with the weather. Here is the truth most men will never admit to themselves. The open field is not your punishment, it is your opportunity. For the first time in years, maybe for the first time in your life, there is no structure telling you who to be. No relationship requiring you to perform a version of yourself. No social circle with unspoken rules about what you can say, what you can want, what you can become. The field is open, the ground is clear, and what you build next, if you have the patience and the courage to build deliberately, will be the first thing in your life that actually belongs to you. But most men cannot tolerate the open field. They rush to rebuild. They download the dating app within a week of the breakup. They force new friendships out of desperation rather than alignment. They fill the calendar not because the events matter, but because the blank space is unbearable. And what they build in haste looks almost identical to what fell. Same patterns, same shallow foundations, same load-bearing illusions. The demolition was wasted, the lonely chapter was endured but not used, and 2 years later they are standing in rubble again, wondering why everything keeps collapsing. Do not be that man, not this time. You have been given something rare. You have been given open ground. The question is whether you will use it to build something that can actually hold weight, or whether you will panic and throw up the same flimsy walls just to have something standing. The wilderness between. There is a passage that every man who has ever become anything real has walked through. It does not have a name in modern language because modern language has no framework for necessary suffering. We call it depression. We call it a rough patch. We call it a quarter-life crisis or a dark night of the soul, and we speak about it as though it is a malfunction, something that should be treated, medicated, optimized away. But the men who came before us, the ones who built philosophies and empires and movements that outlasted their lives, they had a different word for it. They called it the wilderness. The wilderness is not punishment. The wilderness is the space between the old life and the new one. It is the terrain you must cross when the person you were is no longer sufficient, and the person you are becoming has not yet arrived. And the defining feature of the wilderness is this: you cannot see the path. The landmarks you used to navigate by are gone. The compass that used to work, the approval of others, the validation of relationships, the comfort of belonging, that compass spins uselessly now, because the wilderness does not respond to those instruments. The wilderness responds to something else entirely. It responds to the man who is willing to keep walking without knowing where he is going. That is what your loneliness actually is. It is not a symptom. It is the wilderness. It is the necessary passage between the man you were, the man who built his identity around other people's presence, and the man you are becoming. The man who builds his identity around his own integrity. And you cannot cross that passage in a crowd. You cannot navigate it while on the phone. You cannot cheat it by surrounding yourself with noise and hoping the terrain changes without you having to walk through it. The wilderness demands that you walk it alone, not as a cruelty, as a requirement. Because what it is building in you cannot be built in company. Think about what is actually happening to you in this season. The surface looks bleak. Empty weekends, meals alone, long stretches of silence that used to be filled with someone else's voice. But underneath the surface, if you are honest, something else is happening. You are beginning to notice things you never noticed when you were surrounded by people. You are beginning to hear your own thoughts, not the reactive thoughts, not the social performance thoughts, but the deep ones, the ones that only surface when there is enough silence to hold them. You're beginning to discover what you actually like, not what you pretended to like because the group liked it, Not what you performed enthusiasm for because the person you were dating was into it. What you actually, independently, without any social incentive, enjoy. And that discovery, that seemingly small, almost embarrassing discovery, is the foundation of everything. Because a man who does not know what he likes does not know who he is. And a man who does not know who he is will attach himself to anyone who seems to know. He will follow any voice that sounds certain. He will adopt any identity that comes with a group, a label, a sense of belonging. And he will spend his life being shaped by other people's certainty while never developing his own. The wilderness strips that away. It puts you in a place where there is no voice to follow, no group to join, no identity to borrow. There is only you and the terrain. And the terrain asks one question over and over in 1,000 different forms. What do you actually value? Not what were you taught to value, not what sounds impressive, not what would look good to the people you were trying to impress. What do you value enough to carry when no one is watching and no one will know? Some men never answer that question because they never stay in the wilderness long enough. They feel the discomfort of the first few miles and they turn back. They find the nearest town, the nearest relationship, the nearest social group, the nearest distraction, and they settle there, relieved to be out of the open terrain, never realizing that the town they settled in is the same town they left. Same patterns, same shallow ground, same borrowed identity. The man who keeps walking, the man who tolerates the exposure and the uncertainty and the bone-deep loneliness of the middle passage, he reaches something the others never find. He reaches the clearing, and the clearing is not a place. It is a state. It is the state of a man who knows who he is because he has walked far enough from everyone else's opinion to hear his own. Not hear it faintly underneath the noise, hear it clearly, as the only voice in the room. That is what the lonely chapter is offering you, the clearing. But the clearing is on the other side of the wilderness, and the wilderness is on the other side of your willingness to stop running from the silence. The architecture of one. Now we build, not yet with other people, not yet with relationships or friendships or social structures. First, we build alone. Because the most important architecture in a man's life is the architecture he constructs when no one else is in the room. This is the part of the lonely chapter that no one talks about. Everyone talks about the pain. Everyone talks about the loss, the isolation, the ache of empty evenings. But no one talks about the construction that becomes possible precisely because the evenings are empty. No one talks about the fact that the most transformative seasons in the lives of the most remarkable men in history was seasons of solitude, not seasons of networking, not seasons of social climbing, not seasons of romantic fulfillment. Seasons of romantic fulfillment, seasons of being profoundly, uncomfortably alone. And here's why. When you are alone, every hour belongs to you. Every decision is yours. Every compromise you make with yourself, not with someone else's needs, expectations, or comfort level. The man in a relationship negotiates his time. The man in a relationship negotiates his identity. The man in a social structure negotiates his ambitions to fit the ceiling of the room he is in. But the man who is alone, he negotiates with no one. The ceiling is wherever he decides to put it. The hours answer to him. The direction is entirely his. This is not a consolation prize. This is the forge. This is where the raw material of who you might become gets heated and hammered and shaped without the interference of anyone else's vision for your life. And I need you to understand that this is not permanent. The lonely chapter is not your destination. It is your workshop. You are not being sentenced to solitude forever. You are being given a season, a finite, precious, unrepeatable season in which you have total control of the conditions. What you build in this season will determine what you attract when it ends. Let me say that again, because it is the sentence that should rearrange your understanding of everything you are going through. What you build in the lonely chapter determines what you attract when it is over. The man who uses this season to get healthy attracts different people than the man who used it to binge and numb. The man who uses this season to read, to study, to develop skills, to build something with his hands or his mind. He attracts different conversations, different opportunities, different rooms. The man who uses this season to sit with his own thoughts, to process his pain honestly, to understand his patterns and where they came from, he attracts a different kind of relationship than the man who avoided the inner work and looked for someone to make him feel better. This is the architecture one. You are laying foundation right now. Every day of this lonely chapter, whether you know it or not, you are building. The question is whether you are building deliberately or by default. The man who scrolls for 4 hours every night is building. He is building a tolerance for passivity, a dependency on stimulation, and a deep familiarity with the feeling of wasted time. That is architecture too. It is just architecture that will collapse the moment any weight is placed on it. But the man who gets up when the alarm goes off, even though there is no one to impress and no one to report to. The man who exercises alone, not for a photo, not for a partner, but because he made a commitment to himself, and he is the kind of man who keeps commitments, even when the only person who will know is him. The man who sits in the quiet and writes, or reads, or thinks, or builds, not because it is comfortable, but because he understands that the quiet is the raw material, and he is the architect. That man is constructing something, and when the lonely chapter ends, and it will end, what he has built will be visible to everyone who enters his life next. People will call it confidence. They will call it presence. They will call it something magnetic that they cannot quite name. But what it actually is foundation. It is the structural integrity of a man who was alone long enough to know who he is and who built himself deliberately, rather than waiting for someone else to come along and tell him what to build. This is the hidden contract of the lonely chapter. Endure it unconsciously, and you exit it the same man who entered. Endure it deliberately, using every empty hour as a brick, every uncomfortable silence as mortar, every solitary decision as proof that you can trust yourself, and you exit it as someone new. Not new in the superficial sense, new in the structural sense, load-bearing, weight-capable, built to hold what is coming next. The return of fire. There is a moment in every lonely chapter, and I want you to listen carefully because you may be approaching it, or you may be in it right now. There is a moment when something shifts. It does not happen dramatically. It does not arrive with music or revelation or a sudden burst of clarity. It arrives quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the first ember that catches in a pile of kindling that has been waiting all night for a spark. The shift is this. You stop experiencing the silence as emptiness and start experiencing it as space. You stop interpreting the alone time as something missing and start recognizing it as something available. The same hours that felt like punishment begin to feel like privilege. The same empty apartment that felt like a prison begins to feel like a workshop. Nothing external changed. The room is the same. The calendar is the same. You changed. Your relationship to the emptiness changed. And that change, that subtle, internal, almost invisible shift, is the ember. And once it catches, it does not go out. This is where the fire begins. Not the dramatic, roaring fire that burns everything down. The slow fire, the forge fire. The kind of heat that does not destroy material, it transforms it. The man who reaches this point in his lonely chapter stops being a man enduring a season and becomes a man using one. He stops counting the days until the loneliness ends and starts counting what he can build before it does. The energy changes, the posture changes, the eyes change. Something behind them lights up that was not there before. Not happiness, not satisfaction. Something more primal than both. Purpose. You have felt this, or you will feel it. The morning you wake up and realize you have not checked your phone in hours, not because you forgot, but because what you were doing mattered more than what anyone might have sent you. The evening you spend alone and realize at the end of it that you are not relieved it is over. You are almost reluctant to stop. The first time you look at your own life, the one you are building in the silence, and feel something you have not felt in years. Ownership. Not borrowed, not reflected, not dependent on anyone's presence or approval. Yours. That is the fire catching. And every man who has ever emerged from a lonely chapter stronger, clearer, more capable, more grounded, every single one of them will tell you the same thing. The fire did not come from adding something to their life. It came from the space that was created when everything else was removed. The fire was always there. It was buried under noise, under other people's expectations, under the constant performance of social life, under the need to be perceived. The silence did not create the fire. The silence uncovered it. And once it was uncovered, it became the light the man navigated by for the rest of his life. Not the approval of others, not the warmth of a relationship, not the belonging of a group, his own fire, his own light, the illumination that comes from a man who has sat in enough darkness to know what is real and what is shadow. This is what the lonely chapter is building in you if you let it, not comfort. Comfort comes later, and it comes differently than you expect. It comes as a byproduct of alignment, not as a goal you chase. What the lonely chapter builds is fire, the internal source of heat and light that does not depend on external conditions. The kind of fire that burns whether anyone is watching or not. The kind of fire that does not need fuel from other people because it generates its own. The man with that fire walks differently. He enters rooms differently. He speaks differently. Not louder, not more, but with weight. Because his words are not seeking approval, his presence is not seeking validation. He is not performing warmth to attract company. He is warm because the fire is burning. And people feel that. They feel it the way you feel heat from a stove across the room before you even see the flame. They cannot explain it. They call it charisma. They call it energy. They call it something intangible. But it is not intangible. It is specific. It is the fire that was forged in silence, in solitude, in the lonely chapter that most men run from, and only a few walk through. The covenant of solitude. Let me tell you something that will cost you something to hear. The lonely chapter is not the enemy of connection. It is the prerequisite. The man who has never been alone, truly alone, deeply alone, long enough to hear his own voice clearly, that man is not capable of real connection. He is capable of attachment. He is capable of dependency. He is capable of the kind of closeness that is actually just two people using each other to avoid themselves. But connection, the kind where two people see each other fully, without performance, without pretense, without the desperate need for the other person to fill a hole. That requires a man who has already filled his own holes. That requires a man who has walked through the lonely chapter and come out the other side whole. This is the paradox that most men never grasp. You cannot connect deeply with another person until you have connected deeply with yourself, and you cannot connect deeply with yourself while you are surrounded by other people. The noise is too loud, the performances are too constant, the identity shifts are too frequent. You move from room to room, being a slightly different version of yourself in each one, and at the end of the day, you collapse into bed not knowing which version was real. That is not connection. That is fragmentation. And you have been mistaking it for a social life. The lonely chapter asks you to stop fragmenting. It asks you to sit in one room, your room, the quiet one, the empty one, and be one version of yourself, the unedited version, the version that does not know what to do with his hands when there is no one to impress, the version that does not know what to talk about when there is no one to talk to, the version that feels awkward in his own silence because he has spent so long filling that silence with other people's noise. That version of you is not your worst self. He is your truest self. And until you have sat with him long enough to know him, his fears, his desires, his real thoughts, the ones he has never said out loud, you are not ready for the kind of relationships that will actually sustain you. You are only ready for the kind that will distract you. And distraction, no matter how warm it feels, has an expiration date. It always runs out. And when it does, you are back in the empty room, and the truest version of you is still sitting there, still waiting, still unmet. This is the covenant of solitude. It is not a punishment. It is a pact. A pact between you and yourself that says, I will not abandon myself again. I will not hand my identity to another person and call it love. I will not dissolve myself into a group and call it belonging. I will sit here in the uncomfortable quiet until I know who I am, with such clarity that no person, no relationship, no social pressure can make me forget. That is a covenant most men never make. Most men make a different covenant, an unconscious one that says, I will do whatever it takes to avoid being alone with myself. I will date people I do not love. I will maintain friendships that do not challenge me. I will fill every available hour with noise, plans, screens, content, anything to avoid the silence where my own voice might tell me something I am not ready to hear. And that covenant, the unconscious one, is the reason most men live their entire lives surrounded by people and still feel alone. Because the loneliness was never about the absence of others, it was about the absence of self. It was about the absence of self. It was about the man who was so afraid of his own company that he sold his identity for a seat at someone else's table. The lonely chapter is your chance to set that table yourself, to decide what belongs on it, to decide who you invite, not from desperation, not from the frantic need to fill seats, from the grounded, deliberate clarity of a man who has eaten alone long enough to know what he is hungry for. The man in the room. I want to take you back to where we started, the room. The phone on the nightstand, the silence that used to feel like it was swallowing you. You are still in that room. You may be in it right now as you listen to this. The same walls, the same quiet, the same absence of a voice on the other end of a call. But something is different, or something will be different, if you allow what I have told you tonight to take root. The room has not changed, but you have, or you are beginning to. The silence that felt like emptiness, you are starting to hear what is in it. Not nothing, not absence, space. Raw, unstructured, open space. The kind of space architects dream about. The kind of space that becomes something only when someone has the courage to stop seeing it as nothing and start seeing it as everything it could be. The man who sits in this room and sees emptiness will stay empty. He will scroll until the light changes. He will sleep not because he is tired, but because consciousness is too quiet. He will wake up and measure his day by how quickly he can fill it with something, anything that makes the room feel less like a mirror. But the man who sits in this room and sees a workshop, the man who sees the silence as material, the man who understands that every uncomfortable evening, every meal alone, every Friday night without plans is not a verdict on his worth, but an investment in his foundation. That man is doing something most people will never do. He is building a life from the inside out instead of the outside in. You have been building from the outside in your entire life, finding people first and then trying to figure out who to be around them, finding relationships first and then trying to become the person who deserved them, joining groups first and then adopting whatever identity the group required. And every structure you built that way had the same flaw. The foundation was external. The load-bearing walls were other people, and when those people left, as people always eventually do, the whole thing came down. This time, you build from the inside out. You build the foundation first, alone, in the quiet. In the lonely chapter you did not choose, but that chose you. You lay the foundation by deciding what you value, not what you were taught to value. You raise the walls by building habits that serve the man you are becoming, not the man other people expect you to be. You set the cornerstone by making and keeping promises to yourself, small ones at first, then larger ones, until self-trust is no longer a concept but a lived experience. And when the structure is standing, when you can walk through the rooms of your own identity and recognize every wall, every corner, every load-bearing beam as something you built deliberately, then, and only then, do you open the door. Not desperately, not because you cannot bear another night alone. You open the door because the house is ready for guests, because you have something to invite people into, not an empty room that needs their presence to feel alive, a full room that is enhanced by their presence but does not require it. That is the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is an empty room that aches for someone to fill it. Solitude is a full room that chooses to let someone in. You are not there yet, and that is fine. The foundation takes time. The construction takes longer. And there will be nights, many nights, when the quiet is so loud and the room is so empty and the ache is so present that you will want to abandon the project. You will want to call someone you should not call. Open an app you should not open. Go back to the noise that was comfortable even though it was killing you slowly. When that moment comes, and it will come, tonight or tomorrow or next week, I want you to remember something. The ache you feel is not evidence that you are broken. The ache is the growing pain of a man who is becoming something he has never been before. A man who is whole on his own. Not complete. No man is complete, and the pretension of needing nothing is its own kind of emptiness. But whole, structurally sound, built on a foundation that does not shift when someone enters or exits his life. The lonely chapter is not where you were abandoned. It is not where you were forgotten. It is not the wasteland you see when you look at your calendar. It is the room where you finally, for the first time in your life, have enough silence to hear your own voice, enough space to build your own foundation, enough darkness to find your own fire. And the man who walks out of this chapter carrying that fire He does not walk out alone. He walks out as the kind of man other people are drawn to. Not because he needs them, but because he is burning. And people have always, in every age, in every culture, in every corner of human history, moved toward light. You are not in the dark, you are in the forge. And the fire is catching, you can feel it now. That faint heat behind your ribs that was not there a month ago. That flicker of something in the morning that feels almost like purpose. That moment, brief, quiet, easily missed, when you caught yourself building something instead of mourning something. That is the ember. Do not smother it with noise. Do not rush to share it with someone who will not understand. Do not abandon the forge because the heat is uncomfortable. Stay in the room. The fire is yours. And when it is strong enough, when you are strong enough, the room will not be able to contain it. The light will find its way out. And the people who are meant to see it will see it. But not yet. Right now, the work is here, in the silence, in the room. In the lonely chapter that is not your punishment. It is your becoming.